I've been wanting to make a commentary on this for a while now, but I just couldn't think of exactly how to, what more I could say about it, because in essence it's a short, sharp, negative judgment against South Park. I mean, I still enjoy watching South Park, but it has completely lost its edge. It's effectively castrated itself, and I don't know what pressure there might be behind the scenes, but they have sort of painted themselves into a corner, and to some extent, it's not the makers of South Park's fault that culture itself and itself has degenerated to the extent that it has. But I find that because it's degenerated so badly on the left, especially, it's very hard for people who make the kind of satire and the kind of humor that comes out of South Park. Because if they are to actually address that properly and honestly, or in their humor, they would look like that they were taking a partisan line. They would look like that they were pro the other side or something like that. And so you get this. I think Brett Weinstein, to a large extent, suffers from this, where you have to kind of not openly support Trump because, especially Sam Harris as well. Sam Harris suffers from this, where I mean, and they make up these reasons for it because they don't want to be castigated or vilified, perhaps by the mainstream, as having a racist audience or having or whatever blanket accusations the mainstream paints all of the opposition to its ideological narrative all gets lumped into the same, kind of deplorable basket of isms. Um, and I think under that kind of dogmatic orthodox pressure, South Park has succumbed to playing this game where they have to pretend like that they're against both sides and that they're not taking a hard line against one of the sides. I mean, it criticizes Trump all the time, South Park, in some sense, and it just doesn't quite, it's, it doesn't work so well as in terms of the satire because it's literally like, you know, you're punching down. When you vilify Trump, along with the mainstream media hysterical narrative that is, essentially manufactured, it looks like that you're punching down. So it doesn't quite work, and it also completely gives the left, the democratic side of politics, it gives it a kind of a free pass, and which is really what their satire should be focused on at the moment. But they haven't. How would in order to address that, it would look like a partisan line that was being drawn in the sand, that they were making a partisan line. And they care more about not crossing that threshold and sort of keeping the peace and placating some kind of um, ostensible objectivity, that they are actually not being objective in treating the actual underlying problem in culture, as it were, um, and the problem in politics. They're not addressing the elephant in the room, and so it just ends up being quite bad. I mean, you could see this in their special, their COVID special, where they had to, instead, their satire doesn't fall, it doesn't quite sound as good as it used to. It's not as crisp and edgy, and they instead have to address the audience directly. They have to break the fourth wall, and because oh, well, the special on COVID was all about how they essentially the whole satire was based around the fourth wall, and that, I mean, it's clever in a way, but it's not the same kind of satire, and they don't explore the theme, that it's a bit too abstract. Like, I got it, very clever, and yes, and they managed to kind of make points without making the point, But that isn't the point of satire. The point of satire is to metaphorically make the point quite stringently, quite profoundly, so that you can actually see it in some manifested form and explore it in your imagination and in your mind. And it gives you an insight into, because it gives you a metaphor of the underlying theme. That's was the whole point of South Park, and it was always criticized as being right wing, essentially, that it always had these hidden conservative messages or whatever. And well, if it just so happens that pragmatism and reality and common sense, interpersonal, understandings of things happen to be anti-left and therefore conservative, then so be it. But I would think that that's because the left has been a growing, decrepit, ideological, sort of sandcastle that needs eventually to implode, and it just keeps on doubling down. And I mean, I would say that how you would start to reframe this within some kind of South Park metaphor is that, you would have to have Democrats parroting mainstream media, or left leaning people repeating mainstream media, sort of narrative, and then just kind of making non sequitur, like strange conspiracy theory things. I mean, the kind of. I wanted to illustrate this before making those kinds of recommendations. Let me take a step back. I mean, I've heard people try to talk about this. Like, I commented on Daniel Schmattenberger. I'm not saying his name right. I'm very bad at pronouncing it. Anyway, who was trying to, I guess, talk about political polarization and talk about, how we're not seeing the underlying issues, perhaps, and he was trying to give a kind of, as an introduction to talking about this political polarization. He has to say, how both sides have got it wrong in some sense, and you end up having to contrast QAnon with the mainstream CNN narrative, and these things should not be your 2 points of comparison. Why would you compare QAnon conspiracy theories with what CNN is spouting? Like, these are not equivalent sources of information. So, if you want to say that the QAnon people are radical and misinformed, and then you're making comparison with QAnon to what is being spoken about on CNN, you can just see that there is a huge disparate, there's a huge asymmetry here in terms of derangement and hyperrealism. Yes, you can say that there's hyperrealism on the left and on the right, but where it is on the right is completely on the fringe, and where it is on the left, it's completely in the center. And in some sense, the reason why it's not being called out in the center is to exacerbate the fringe on the right. But it's an unfair comparison. You can't compare these two things as if they're, uh, um, you're comparing apples and oranges. And that kind of placating, just pretending to be a non-partisan and to take things objectively and to make such comparisons, is sadly to continue to promulgate this delusion that somehow culture is evenly broken all over the place, and that the nexus of all of this toxicity is not the left, and the kind of the craziness, and the ideological radicalization of now what passes as the kind of as the foundation of the Democratic Party. Um, and so, I mean, I do think that South Park would have to delineate three separate groups of people, generally, vaguely speaking. That you might have some people on the fringe on the right, and then you've got sort of the center right, uh, and then you've got the left, which is just essentially completely lunatics, and then you've got essentially the disaffected left, which knows that they don't have a political home, which are essentially, and then you, but you're, hmm. But essentially the general distrust that is promulgated, especially by identity politics, which is, as far as I can see, is a kind of an accelerationist ploy of the left to try to dismantle and destabilize capitalism in the West and culture, and to demoralize people so that they will take a kind of a top-down authoritarian solution to problems which they are exacerbating and accelerating through essentially just. I made a recording which will be released probably when this is released, talking about the dishonesty of the left and the opportunism of the left to kind of to gravitate towards ethical frameworks which are convenient for a top-down command economy and a centrally controlled society and a top-down controlled society. And so identity politics and also climate change are both convenient for this, because they both provide moral justification for authoritarian interventionism, essentially, or for a planned and controlled top-down system of economic organization. And the more that they can weaken the system so that that appears to be the only solution, and it's weird because as they kind of undermine the functioning of the system, then they say, oh, you see, the system needs to be replaced by something more extreme because it can't hold up under this pressure which they are piling onto it and forcing yet further inefficiency. You know, like when you have these artificial. I went into. I'm not going to repeat the whole argument, but essentially, you know, when you obsess about carbon dioxide, which isn't even a pollutant, and you completely all ignore all the evidence and the data and the thinking, and you perversely incentivize people to develop theories around climate change, which you can only get money if you prove climate change. You know, they have corrupted a whole. They've created a whole artificial industry for climate change, and everyone has forgotten about pollution. Everyone has forgotten about real environmentalism. Has all been sidelined by essentially controlling something which isn't even um, I would say we do need a level of even international cooperation to perhaps outlaw certain kinds of industrial processes that create certain kinds of toxic waste and that standardize or involve turning certain waste products into decomposed biodegradable, sort of anyway, and all of that energy is essentially being crowded out and diverted into this false moral panic over carbon dioxide. um, and all this bunk over climate. And I'll just repeat the example that I gave in the other recording, which is that people forget that in recorded human history the climate has changed extremely. Egypt used to be the breadbasket of Rome. It used to be very, very fertile. The banks of the Nile used to produce so much agriculture, it was insane. And during it even precipitated, I would say, the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, that Egypt lost its growing season because of climate change. Climate has always changed, and is in some sense climate. The stability that we've had in our climate is a bit of a historical freak. It's because of the Little Ice Age. Climate is generally much more volatile And so just because we're coming out of now the little ice age, and we're experiencing, let's say, more natural climate, which happens to be more volatile, um, and it's, yeah, it's just, yeah, the misinformation around this stuff, I mean, it lends me towards, kind of political conspiracy theories to some degree. But anyway, let me just move on from this issue. This is a bit of a red herring. I don't want it to spoil the other things that I have to say. But the let me just focus on politics, perhaps. So, I mean, what the left and the Democratic Party has essentially been doing is controlling the mainstream media, um, or getting agreement from the mainstream media to a large part into sanctifying and normalizing their abnormal political sentiments and policy platforms, or even non-policy platforms. And to a sickeningly depraved degree of essentially journalistic irresponsibility. So journalists are certainly, should bear the brunt of blame. The industry of journalism, um, is fundamentally sort of broken and corrupt and irresponsible. So, again, I would, in the South Park metaphorical world, I would say that, you're going to have journalists being, sort of like mind controlled, brainless, sort of programmed, uh, uh, I don't know, stooges, or something like that. But what the Democratic Party has done essentially is, instead of having to substantiate their own position, they have just used satire against their enemies. They have tried to, any opposition that's made against their position, they just disdain, and they just reflexively, um, rebuke without substance. They expect that their dismissal of their opposition is is a kind of is a symbolic, um, front, uh, for the fact that their substance is beyond question, and that their substance doesn't even have to be iterated. It must just be automatically regarded as morally superior. And this is very dangerous in anything, because, I mean, this is the kind of move that authoritarian culture depends on, this kind of assumed moral superiority, and this lack of, um, so, I mean, this is the core of toxicity, is that they don't have to engage in debate. They don't have to engage in substantive exploration into any issue. They are beyond challenge. And they just have to kind of virtue signal. They just have to make blanket accusations. They just have to keep on pumping out accusations for the other person that has to kind of prove a negative. So that they get their opposition so tied up into trying to prove a negative that they never have to prove the positive of their own case, because all skepticism is put on their opposition. So their opposition has to come up with ways of surmounting every technical suspicion that can be possibly imagined against them. And this is the fundamental asymmetry of a very toxic culture that has essentially been taken over. And, you know, it's a dark time, And South Park would ordinarily perhaps be able to point at the sacred cow and put it on a pedestal and make it accessible and viewable. Um, but instead, they are now prone to playing the game because they don't want to be under the ire of this Eye of Sauron, which is essentially that they can, there's no room for comedy because the Democrats are now the comedians because they get to use satire against having to defend against their political adversaries and their political opposition. They're not in the realm of substance. They are like this kind of cult comedian. Um, and I would say that South Park is guilty of sitting back and watching this happen and not, at least not intuiting this and not coming up with a response, not coming up with a with metaphorically describing a tension against this trend, this very troubling trend. And I think to a large extent, cultural figures should be judged to the extent that they have intuited and how they have responded to this. And as I've already said, I hold Sam Harris to be and Brett Weinstein to both be somewhat guilty fence sitters on this point. That instead of sort of taking instead of being a more pragmatic and candid about these issues, they are somewhat playing the superficial game that has been constructed and framed and projected from the Democratic side of politics. And I've actually disgustingly seen people blame Trump for this, when Trump is not the cause of this. Trump is if anything the natural symptom of this sickness which existed on the left first, and which Trump is very good at bringing this to a head to some degree, and to the extent to which that he has not been culturally endorsed for this magnificent function that he is performing for the political arena. I think that also shows a certain level of either a lack of intuitive insight and or perhaps a lack of independent, candid or perhaps an undervaluing of the necessity of I think what a lot of people don't understand in terms of Brett Weinstein and even Eric Weinstein as well, what they don't understand is that culture is like a light. And although you can intellectually say, I know what's going on, I know what's happening in the background, intellectually I can track all the themes and all the ideas, well, good for you. Well, culture can't see everything that you can see. Culture has a filter and it has a light that shines on a part of the picture. And what we have to do is the light, the part of the picture that is illuminated and being focused on by culture, we have to fix the filter of the part of it that it's looking at, because without clarity, without a culture of transparent clarity, we're never going to be able to fix anything when it's put under the spotlight. So whatever it happens to be under the spotlight, we need to try and get that crystal clear. And we have to prioritize and get the morality clear before we get any of the extraneous or nuanced issues. And so, people who want to try to obscure what is currently culturally, let's say, pertinent by these other eccentric um, tangents of layers which fundamentally undermine, let's say, the necessity or the um, health and structure of the cultural mind and the and the shared culture. And you know there's always an opportunity either to steer culture towards a different part of the picture that is more seminal in generating a resolution or a greater synthesis, or so it can be advantageous to criticize cultures focusing on the wrong part of the picture. I will accept that. But when it's roughly on the right part of the picture, but it's not taking into account all these eccentric notions that you might have on the same subject, um, then make a case that should be the central issue. But if it shouldn't be the central issue, if it is a tangent, then let's at least try and get it clear what it is that culture is looking at. Um, well, I find especially Eric Weinstein often guilty of that. Um, and it comes across very unattractively as a kind of very caustic and corrosive, and a kind of a weird sort of subversive second guessing of the collective mind, instead of either make an accessible critique of the public mind, of the cultural zeitgeist, um, but don't make these esoteric gripes, which are personal sentiments which have absolutely no impact and absolutely no place that they can be installed or digested, because that is really just, I mean, I don't know what that is. That's just a personal, um, this is what I've always liked about South Park, is that it's had this energy of cultural priority and cultural, um, of pointing out cultural issues which are prescient and which have a moral edge to them, which say something about individual morality or individual ethics. And that is what the satire has always been about. It's been about arming people about a hot, sharp take on what's going on in the zeitgeist and how to interpret it and how it reflects on individual values and morality. That has always been the themes that South Park has been so good at exploring, and allowing people to reflect on, using South Park as a metaphor for those issues. And but now that's not possible, it seems, because they have somewhat lost their testosterone, I would say, or they I mean, they feel like they can't say something too definitive about COVID because they would get vilified by one half of the of the population or something like that. They or that they would be dogpiled by the mainstream media if they appeared to be one direction over another direction. And if you try to mix the message rather than having an understandable message, rather than having an accessible and understandable point, then you just become an insipid, nebulous, amorphous um, sort of fence sitter. Uh, and there's a lack of moral vision in South Park that there wasn't before, and maybe that's because now it's the morality is so centered around political issues, um, and they have not been so keen to get into essentially political commentary or political punditry. Whenever they've had political commentary, they have always made the presidential candidates both negative. Um, they have, you know, never been on the side. Uh, they've never wanted to look like they were supportive uh, of a reigning, I guess, political force, um, or an incumbent, or any political faction, I guess. And they've somewhat painted themselves into a corner, it seems, now, because so much of the cultural hot button issue is grounded in political themes, and it is complicated. But I mean, this could be tackled just on a cultural level. This could perhaps just be tackled by looking at the supporters of the factions and not at the actual figureheads themselves, i.e., I guess Trump. Um, I almost don't see the point of pitting him against Joe Biden, because you know it could be anyone in the Democratic establishment, it seems, and they're all pretty much as um, compromised and essentially just figureheads of, you know, a very toxic, um, morally unhinged sort of center of gravity that is trying to get all of society to be captured by its influence, and its sort of narrative over reality and identity. Um, anyway, the actual, you know, this recording should probably be seen with the recording that I made on Tim Pool interviewing Vorsh, who is a kind of a left wing sort of socialist type, and I kind of critique his kind of political dishonesty, or comment on that style of politics, and I think that, well, that sort of slots into this here, because you get those kinds of, I mean, perhaps it's just too gritty and real and visceral, and so antithetical, and so sort of, you know, because essentially, if you're going to take on the Democratic Party like this, and you're going to describe them or out them as having bad faith, it's really dark. You know, it's really, I mean, to think that there's such a huge political force in America that is just so corrupt and in line with plutocrats who are willing to go along with revolutionary ideology to help to launder and fraudulently pass off their, you know, kind of oligarchical forms of corruption and, you know, sort of plutocratic elitism, um, which, you know, to a large extent make the natural functioning of the economy, you know, quite lopsided and undermine a lot of things.